What's up, gangsters? It's time for one of my favorite kind of videos, but that has been all too rare lately, and that's for a finished project. I have not finished anything in like 6 months. It's just been kind of weird timing. Honestly, I think I've got 4 or 5 things going on, but only one of them has made it to the checkered flag. And honestly, that's part of the reason why I decided to do it a couple of weeks ago, because I just wanted to do some painting and wanted to finish something. And I thought, well, this shouldn't take too long. Should be pretty straightforward. And it is the Young Miniatures Flying Tiger bust. I don't have the box. Well, I do, but I used it to paint on, so yeah. Forgot that I might want to show you guys the box art. Anyway, it has been good fun and good experience. Yeah, see, there. That's what the box looks like now. Anyway, this is the second one of these busts, 1/10 scale busts that I've done. And this honestly is the one that I should have started with. When I did the Mustang pilot, or whatever he's called, I did it because I thought, oh, this will be simple and straightforward and a good way to start to develop some figure painting chops. That bust ended up being very difficult, not just from a painting standpoint, but just difficult to build and to work with resin and learn how to use hot water to bend it and all that stuff because of his oxygen mask and parachute cord and all that stuff. And this is the one I should have started with because it literally has 5 pieces. So it's pretty simple and pretty straightforward from a kit point of view. But it's still a challenge to paint and make it look decent. I'm not honestly totally sure how I feel about the results on this one, but I guess you guys can take a look at it and see what you think. Here we go. Alright, so here is the finished product. And like I said, there's not a whole lot to say about the kit itself. It consists of his torso, the pole that you mount him on, his head, and his chin strap. And honestly, the only part of it that was any bit of a challenge at all was the chin strap, because it's a straight piece when it comes out of the box, and it needs a little bit of bending to make it drape naturally across his collar right there. But it wasn't too bad, and the truth is, I actually did that when I had already put paint on it because I didn't realize that it was going to need to be bent. And I already had paint on it, and when I went to fit it up there during final assembly, I was like, oh, that's not quite going to work. So at any rate, got a little bit ahead of myself, but these things happen. And it was fine. A little bit of the paint came off while I was doing that, and I just touched it up. It's got a little bit of a goober on the chin part, but I decided that it added some character and elected not to do anything about it. It's got a little bit of a goober in the paint inside of his lip, and of course I didn't see that when I was photographing it yesterday. Yeah, well, it is what it is. It doesn't show up in the photos, or I would have already fixed it. Anyway, that's one thing I've learned about these little bust things is with both of them, I've taken the first round of pictures and realized that there were things that I needed to do and touch-ups that I needed to make, and brought it back to the bench, done those, gone ahead and taken the pictures and declared it done, and then decided even after that that there were little things, and basically just said, yeah, it's over, I'm finished, it is what it is. And that's really true of all my projects, because I'm never totally satisfied, but for whatever reason, I don't know, it just seems to happen more with these figures. And I think that the truth is that that's probably a result of my skills, which just honestly are not that great with these things, which is why I'm trying to learn. But one of the things that makes these things more challenging is that these things are hand sculpted. And the challenge comes with the fact that anything that's really tiny and hard to paint is also obviously really tiny and hard to sculpt. And so what that means is that some of the features are not as crisp as you might like them to be when you're staring at them through an optivisor and trying to get a very tiny paintbrush on them. Things like the eyes and the eyeballs, they look pretty good from over here, but when you get up close like this, like you are when you're painting, if you can focus, then you start to see, and you really can't even see it even at this zoom, you have to be super zoomed in. You start to see that there are some little goobers in the sculpting that make it tough to get the thing painted really cleanly and crisply, at least at my skill level. I've had my best success with figures that are either modeled from 3D models or modeled from 3D models. That's not redundant at all. Computer modeled. Anyway, so all the features are really crisp, or figures that have come from 3D scans that are then turned into computerized point cloud data and 3D printed. Because the features are all super crisp and it's easy to get good color separations. So, whereas on this one, things like his patch is pretty crisp and pretty easy to paint around. The insignia on the patch is not quite as good. And you can really see that better on this patch over here on his other shoulder, where, again, the patch itself, nice and crisp, but the insignia is not so great, and I suck, so, they don't look all that good. But it kind of is what it is, and I'm certainly, the part of the problem is that I don't really notice that until I get to painting, and by then it's too late to really fix it, even if I had the skills or the know-how to do that. So, yeah, it just kind of becomes it is what it is. Same thing with the Flying Tiger patch here. That was a real challenge to paint, even as reasonably as that. He still looks kind of goofy. I think he looks more like a flying chupacabra than a flying tiger, but hey, whatever. It's at least a facsimile of the patch. But point being is that you don't get any help from the sculpting on stuff like that. You're pretty much on your own. You get a basic outline, and you kind of have to work at it as best you can. And I'm sure that the real figure painters out there who may be watching this are just snickering at, my pathetic whining about this, and they're not wrong, because really good figure painters don't need any sort of a molded outline at all to paint something really cool like that. But I am not one of those figure painters, and honestly, I never will be. So I need all the help I can get. At any rate, I do want to talk about the painting on this for a couple of reasons. One is that, some people have asked me to explain how I do it, and I've assured them that I am the wrong guy to ask because, as I keep saying, I'm just not very good at this. But I want to help out where I can. But the other reason is that I feel like that if I go through my process for doing this, that it will help me get it more firmly cemented in my own mind, so that the next time I tackle one of these, I won't feel as much like I was starting from scratch as I did on this one. So here's how I've done this. And I should state right off the bat that I probably take a different approach to this than people who are actual figure painters. And the reason is because I'm dumb and I suck. And I need a system, just kind of like the molded in details, that helps me as much as possible. So, number one, I don't use acrylics. I've tried, I just don't get along with them. In fact, I started to do this one using Joe Sonia acrylics. If you're not familiar with those, they are tube acrylics. They kind of have the consistency of oils, but they are in fact acrylics. And I tried, and the results weren't terrible, but I just really did not get along with them as well as I do with oils. For me, oils just are intuitive and easier to work with. There are some caveats to that I'll get into in a minute, but the bottom line is that my overall strategy with figures is acrylic base coats and oils for shading and a lot of detail painting. That's the basic strategy. Now, specifically how I broke this one down, I primed it just using my everyday Mr. Surfacer 1500 primer, and then I brush painted the base coats, what some figure painters call blocking the colors in. So basically I chose the basic color that I wanted for all of the major elements: the jacket, the shirt, his gun belt, the helmet, the flesh, all of those things. And I brushed those on with acrylics, and oddly enough, the paint that I ended up using for almost everything on this, because everything is basically shades of gray and brown, I used my Badger Stynylrez primers, because I've got a pretty complete set of them. I've got their black, I've got their green, they've got a neutral yellow, I've got a rust base that I use that's pretty good as a base for a leather flight jacket and leather helmet. And this is just, they have an orange rust shade, and I mix it with black to get this. But this stuff, in addition to being a probably the best acrylic primer out there, is a wonderful brush paint. I can't explain it, but the stuff is just fantastic. It brushes wonderfully. It comes out of the bottle relatively thin, but not. It's thin enough that it moves and flows with the brush very easily, very nicely, but it doesn't get out of control. It's not going to flow down into crevices and get away from you, get into places where you don't want it to be. And so it makes it really pretty friendly. It dries relatively quickly. It covers really well. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. It just is a really good brush paint. For other things where I don't have the right colors with Stynylrez, I've been using Mission Models. Mission Models is another really good brush paint. I have a bunch of it because I tested it a few years ago, and it's the only acrylic, or what I would call normal acrylic that I know of, that brushes just about as well as it sprays. Obviously, you have to thin this stuff if you want to airbrush it, but it brushes with a paintbrush right out of the bottle just beautifully. Again, because of the viscosity of it, it's just easy to control. And I'll show you what I mean. I don't know how it compares really to the brush paints that most of the acrylic figure painters use, like the Vallejos and Citadels and stuff like that, because I've never used those for a lot of brush painting. But whoops, it's a little. There you go. You can kind of see. That's kind of what the viscosity of it is like. So again, stiff enough to stay put, but still wet enough to flow pretty easily to where you need it. So I like it a lot for this purpose, and that's what I used to do some of the basic color blocking on things like the insignia and the patches. And that worked pretty well, but there's a critical step in there that I don't want to forget about. After I got all of the big colors blocked in, the jacket, shirt, belt, all that stuff, I went ahead and laid down a pretty generous layer of aqua gloss. And I did that because I knew that when I started doing the detail work on these patches that I was going to screw up. That was just inevitable. And that if I did screw up, I wanted to be able to very quickly take a brush dampened with IPA and clean up where I had colored outside the lines without screwing up whatever was underneath it. So like, for example, when I was doing this patch here, if I slipped off the edge of the patch with the white and got into the brown, I wanted to be able to immediately clean that white off. And I knew that I'd be able to do that because with aqua gloss, even though it is susceptible to alcohol, if you are too aggressive, if you clean up a mistake like that really quickly, I mean like within minutes. In fact, what I do when I'm painting stuff like this is I've got the paintbrush that I'm painting with in my hand, and I've got my cleanup brush between my teeth, so that I can immediately grab it if I make a mistake and take care of that. Fortunately, there were not too many of those, but that's how I isolate the layers to protect myself from myself, because it's inevitable that I'm going to screw up. And so that works pretty well for me. I will do as many layers of aqua gloss as I need to keep barriers between stuff as I go along. It's kind of like when I'm working in Photoshop. I will try to limit my moves in Photoshop to basically one per layer, so that I can go up to the next layer and work on that, knowing that everything that I've done before is going to be preserved if I have some kind of a disaster. So a very similar approach. And I do the same thing with the oils. So once I had all of the colors that I wanted to do with acrylics on and locked in with aqua gloss, then I came along with a quick coat of Tester's Dull Coat, which is just lacquer. It's the OG Ungloss, and I just thin it with cheap hardware store lacquer thinner. And that gives me a nice flat finish that provides good traction for the oil paints. Some people prefer to do oils on a satin finish. It's kind of whatever you prefer, because with oils, it really is, at least as far as I can say at this point, all about feel. And how successful you are at getting what you want out of oils, it seems to me, at least at this point, that it's really very much about getting the viscosity correct, getting the surface to work with you so that they stay put where you want them. and in selecting the right brushes. And I mean, the oils are just really sensitive to tools and technique. So at any rate, once I've got this thing flattened down with that layer of dull coat, so at this point I've got primer, I've got acrylic base coat, I've got aqua gloss, and then I've got dull coat. Now I'm ready to start with the oils. And you can see from these palettes that I've gotten out here how that kind of goes. It is messy and unscientific. But what I do here is I use this medium weight matte photo paper as a palette for a couple of reasons. One is that it's cheap and I've got plenty of it, but also because it's white, I get a true representation of the colors. So I can see immediately exactly what sort of tone I'm going to get. Now, the one disadvantage is that, as you can see, it leaches the oils out relatively quickly, which is a little bit of a disadvantage. And what I'm hoping is that maybe down the road when I get better with oils, I'll get a real palette, made out of plastic or ceramic or whatever, that I can use to mix my oils on, and then I'll put it in the refrigerator each day after I'm done, because I've been told that that's the way you can keep your oils soft and usable for the entire duration of a project. And that would be good, because one of the hassles for me is that doing it this way, if I mix up a color that I really like today and I use it today, and then I come back tomorrow and I need to do a touch-up, well, I've got to mix the color again and try to match it. And, that's good practice, but it'd be better to not have to do that. So at any rate, that is the entire, almost the entire amount of oil work that I did on this figure, preserved right there. And what I'm using for all these are Winsor & Newton artist colors, a little bit of Winton stuff just because I have it. And for certain things where I don't use a lot of it, like the blue that I might need for the insignia or the eyeballs, I just use the Winton stuff for that. I also happened to just I decided to try the Winsor & Newton Alkyd, and so I have a tube of the raw sienna, and that's what this is right here. And the Alkyd is interesting because it works just like regular oils, but it's a synthetic instead of having like linseed or safflower oil in it. It basically is the equivalent of the enamels that we use in weathering products, because those are, as far as I understand, Alkyd based. And an Alkyd is basically just a synthetic fat, because that's how oils work. The oil in an oil paint is what's called a drying oil, and it's basically something like that's organic, like safflower oil, linseed oil, walnut oil, whatever the case may be. And that leaches out when you've got it on a palette like this. And so what I do to restore that is I've got a little bottle of Winsor Newton linseed oil that I got on the recommendation of Carlos Starton, who is an actual really world-class figure painter. And so you can use this to soften your oils, make them smoother to any consistency that you want. I also sometimes use the Winsor Newton Sans Odor, which is just their odorless mineral spirits. But those are both really important tools to getting the oil paints to be the consistency that you need them to be. And I'll explain what those situations are here in a second, as soon as I finish picking up everything that I dropped on the floor when I reached to get those two bottles. The basic shading work that I do is with the oil paint pretty much straight out of the tube. There's not a lot of reason, at least for me, as far as I know, at this point, to make it any thinner. And what I use for that is brushes like these Lowe and Cornell, these are Royal and Lang Nickel, whatever it is. This is their soft grip number 2, and it's kind of, they call it a combo. It's kind of a chisel, or not a chisel, but it's basically like a number 2 filbert. And this is a super handy brush for lots and lots of things. But for doing shading and blending, it's a fantastic little brush. When it gets to doing things that are more precise, I'm using these Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. Now, this is the miniature series. You can see right there where that says miniature. And apparently they have two different lines. The other ones have a longer tip on them. And my understanding is that they're better for acrylics because you want the brush to be completely full of paint when you're doing acrylics. But with oils, you really, at least I only work with the very tip of the brush. And sometimes I have so little paint on there that you can barely even see it. And so for me, a short bristle like that provides a lot better control. And I'll use the 0 and the 000 quite a bit for doing detail work as well. I use the 000 I use a lot for doing detail work like eyeballs and that kind of thing. But the 0, and I've also got a number 2. I will use some for refining shading in tight areas. So, you know, if I'm trying to do some shading, like around like his patch there, for example, that filbert brush is a little too big, a little too much like a shotgun for that sort of thing, and that's when I'll get out one of those other Winsor Newton brushes. Anyway, for me, the magic of oils is that this shading and blending just becomes so much easier because you just start putting it where you want it, and then you just work it, and you just keep working it until it looks the way you want. And if it doesn't ever get to where you're happy with it, you just take a Q-tip with some mineral spirits on it and just wipe it right off. Boom, start over. And it's so forgiving, and that's what I need. The difference is that with acrylics, you know, you're using glazes and they dry almost immediately, and you're not going to remove them if you screw up. You have to keep painting over them until you get what you want. So for me, it's nice having that confidence in the back of my mind that no matter how stupid things get, I'm never committed until I walk away and let it dry for a day. Because it is, and even then you can really still remove it with mineral spirits. So speaking of drying time, that's one beef that a lot of people have with oils, is that they feel like it takes forever to dry. That is just simply not true. Yeah, some colors can take longer than others, and they will seem like they are never ever dry. And you can see that a little bit here. Like this is, you know, this little wad of the alkyd, which is supposed to be faster drying, is still really soft, and you know, there's obviously still some wet paint inside that glove. And you know, same thing with some of these others. They're obviously not dry. But look, this is not like oil painting on canvas. Nothing that we do with scale models and oil paints is like that. We, at least as far as I know, are always going to be working in really, really tiny amounts of paint with very, very thin layers. And honestly, with some of this stuff, I have clear coated it like 8 hours later, the same day. Definitely 24 hours later. And if I have any doubt about it, at least in the wintertime, I'll just set this thing in front of a space heater overnight and let it blow hot air on it for 10 or 12 hours, and then it will definitely be cured by the next morning. And you know, and you can come along with a layer of dull coat to lock in everything that you've done, and then start on the next thing. Again, using that same barrier coat strategy to protect the work you've done already that you're happy with from whatever mistakes you're about to make. So I have honestly got probably a half dozen layers of Tester's dull coat on this thing because of working that way. It's just, just gives me confidence going forward, knowing that if I did manage to get something right, that I don't have to worry about screwing it up on down the line. Now, I want to talk about one other technique that I like to use a lot with oils, and I do this with this kind of thing and a lot with weathering on the other types of models that I do a lot more of, and that is using sponges that are slightly dampened with mineral spirits. If you look closely, you can see this texture of the worn leather in his jacket. What I was trying to portray here was the idea that his parachute straps have just, over time worn off that part of his jacket. And so what I do to achieve that is I brush it on using the filbert brush and to get it blended the way that I want. And then I take that sponge and it's got to be just barely damp with mineral spirits. And then just start using this stippling and dabbing motion. And, if you watch what you're doing, you'll start to see the effect where it's picking up little tiny bits of paint, and it's almost creating a chipping effect. But you can see it creates a really nice, random sort of effect that looks good for that worn leather, looks good for that cloth right there. So it really, you just pick your color and go for it. While I'm talking about the patch, just to note, the way that I did this Japanese, or I guess it's Chinese actually, since these guys were stationed in China, I just I downloaded and printed a picture off the internet of this blood chit that they had sewed to the back of their jacket, and I used that as my guide, and I drew those on there with a pencil. And once I was relatively confident, I came back with a .05 archival ink black pen and painted them on there with that. And I'm actually kind of proud of that. I feel like I managed to pull that off reasonably well. I don't think it looks great. Probably anybody who could actually write Chinese would laugh. Hopefully it doesn't say something like "kick me, I'm stupid." But hey, I think it looks the part. So anyway, I think that, I don't know a whole lot more to say about the techniques that I'm using as far as how I am painting these oils on here. And it probably wouldn't do a whole lot of good for me to describe it in any further detail, because the truth is, and this is what I've learned with oils, it's really, like I said, I must have said it half dozen times already just in this video, it's really all about feel. And they're super sensitive to tools and technique, and you just have to get the feel for it. You just have to get in there and work them and start to see how they behave and try to get the effects that you want. And, if it doesn't work, then you change, you erase what you're doing, change the viscosity of the paint, until you get it figured out. That's how I have gotten to where I can even do this kind of outlining at all. Like if you look here at his gun belt, you can see that that's outlined in a pretty opaque black. And this is a thing that, again, I picked up from Carlos. Washes don't work on stuff like this. I know that if you're like an aircraft modeler, you want to use a Panaline wash because it's super easy, and you look at this and you think, oh, I'll just throw some wash on here. It'll fill in all these low spots. It'll be awesome. Problem is, it just doesn't work that well because you just don't have the kind of distinct little square-edged grooves that you do on something like that, where it'll hold a wash and look really good. What you have are these sort of more vaguely defined boundaries between things, and washes just don't work. And so you need to be able to just paint a very thin line there. And I've done the same thing around the borders of the blood chit. You can see that. It's just barely there, but you can see. It's a step that it's tough to do, but it's a step that adds a level of finish to the work, because even if people can't really look at it and say and notice it, subconsciously it sharpens up those color separations and creates the impression of depth that you would see on the real thing. I mean, like when you look at my sleeve right there where it meets my hand, there's a tiny, tiny thin shadow right there. And so that's what you're trying to recreate when you paint those black lines. And that's been a learning process. I'm still not that good at it. But what I do for those is that's where I take the paint out of the tube and put it into a little, I use these, grab this one out of the trash, hold on. These things are called weighing boats. And I get these like in a pack of 100 for like $10 from Amazon. And this is where I'll mix oils with the linseed oil or with the mineral spirits. But for something like, I use mineral spirits if I want to create a wash. But for painting those black outlines, I'm mixing some black and some gray and maybe some brown to create a slightly off black. And then I add some of the linseed oil to it until it's a really nice, smooth, creamy consistency of paint. And then you can just get in there with a tiny, tiny little brush with just a little bit of that on the tip and just follow along the edges of the of whatever thing it is that you're trying to outline. And it's tedious. It takes a long time. But I think that the effect is really worthwhile. And again, if you screw up and your lines are a little crooked or too thick or whatever, just come in with a brush that's got a tiny little bit of mineral spirits on it and just very carefully clean that up. It's just a process of working it, and that's why I love oil paints so much. Speaking of tools, I also want to mention this. This is great. This is just a cheapo X-Acto handle, and this is a piece of Tamiya steel or nickel silver photo etch that I cut into a nice little spatula blade. It's nice and springy, and that's what I use to mix these paints. Now, I know that what scares a lot of people about working on figures is doing skin tones. And hey, it's totally justifiable. It's the scariest part of doing figures. When I did my first one of these, people gave me all kinds of hell about his skin tone because I made him relatively pale. And they were like, dude, he looks like a vampire. Well, so I went full on spray tan for this guy. I wanted him to have a rugged, more sun-tanned, outdoorsy look. Because, hey, he's been out in the weather, in primitive airfield conditions in China for a while, and, he looks rough. So, at any rate, the base coat that I created for this was, again, with the acrylics that I used for the Stynylrez. And what I try to do is make that base coat for all of this stuff be about where the mid-tone is going to be. Then what I try to do with the oils is, first off, match the mid-tone with my mix. Or I guess in this case I actually start with the highlight for skin tone anyway. So for average white dude skin, what I'm starting with is a mixture of about 1 part titanium white to 2 parts raw sienna. And I mix that up, and that gives me this basic skin tone. Then I tone that with burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna, whatever I need to create the mid-tone and then the highlight, the mids, and the shadows. Now there is some alizarin crimson on here that a lot of people like. I don't use it for my skin tones because I just don't really like a pinkish tint to the skin tones on my figures. And that's really just kind of a personal preference. I know that some people like to have that pinkish tint to the skin because they feel like it looks more lively, but I just look at the back of my hand. There's not a whole lot of pink. Well, maybe on camera there is, but when I'm looking at it in real life, it's relatively tan. So that's what I like, is just a relatively tan, simple skin tone. And so you can see that, what I do is once I've got the oils mixed up for the highlights and the shadows, I do the shadows first, give that overnight to set up, and then I come back the next day and do the highlights. And it's, you know, it's relatively straightforward sounding, but again, it's just a matter of technique and practice to even get it, you know, to whatever level of proficiency I've got it here. Not great, but passable. So where I do use the alizarin or alizarin or however you say it, this raspberry color, where I do use that, you can see that I've got it mixed up, is for getting some tone on lips. You can see, don't want to have him looking like he's got lipstick on, but a little bit there, and then in the corners of the eyes. Speaking of the eyes, yeah, that's just a challenge. I mean, it just is what it is. They're just not easy, especially when they're not real crisply molded. But I do the basic outline with a black or an almost black, or I guess a dot that basically locates the cornea. I'm trying to think of all the correct names of the eyeball. Then once I'm happy with that, then I add the base color of the cornea, the blue, and then I'll put a barrier coat on that to protect it. Then I'll come back and do the pupil and the outline, and then I'll put a barrier coat on that to protect that. And then as I work my way along, I will do things like outlining on the eyelid using highlights and shadows. Come on, focus. Using highlights and shadows of the skin tones, so you can kind of see what's going on there. And again, working those areas in oils, man, that's the only reason that I can even get it looking halfway decent, because it's so easy to correct. So if I have a goober, I know that a little bit of mineral spirits, I can wash it off and fix it. So there you go. I don't really know how much more I can say. That's the basic process that I do. And I hope that helps you guys. Again, it is something that takes a lot of practice. It can be frustrating, but I really feel like that the way that I do this is relatively easy compared to doing it with acrylics. And maybe that's just because I suck and I just can't figure out the right way to use acrylics. But bottom line is, you got to find a method that works for you. And this is that method in my case. Okay, so of course, after I finished that last bit, I thought of some things that I forgot to say. So, two things. You may have noticed, or hopefully you noticed, that there's a slightly different sheen on certain parts of the leather jacket and the helmet. And that's very purposeful. I hope that the effect comes through, because what I wanted to do was emphasize that some parts of the leather are very worn and matte, and then other parts are still in pretty good shape and have that natural sort of leather sheen to it. So what I did is, after the last layer of dull coat and all the painting was done, I came back and masked off the patches and his face and various things using some of the latex type liquid masking fluid, and then very selectively sprayed on some basically just a satin, which was just like a 50-50 mixture of dull coat and Tester's gloss coat, both obviously lacquers. And I think it shows up fairly well. I think it looks pretty decent. It's a pretty straightforward effect. But this kind of gets into what is sort of my basic strategy with these things, which is to try and do as much as I can to give them realistic textures and levels of sheen. So that gets into the second thing, which is the eyeballs and the goggles. Now, I know that a lot of the really good acrylic painters, they like to paint things like reflections on goggles and the catch light in somebody's eyeballs. If you're not familiar with the term catch light, that's just a photography and painting term that refers to the reflection of light that you get on your eyeball because of the wet, shiny surface. And you can obviously paint that on with just a little bit of white, but yeah, you got to be more skilled than I am. So not only am I not too good at that, but I also am not confident that I could really paint goggles with a reasonable reflection on the lenses. So because of that and the fact that I'm trying to produce sort of realistic textures, the first thing I do is on the eyeballs is that after they're all dry and done, is I put a little bit of future on them. Yes, future is good for some things, and it's really nice for this type of thing. It takes 2 or 3 layers to get a nice glossy shine on those eyeballs, but it's easy to control with a small paintbrush and does a good job. As far as the goggles go, what I've done there is given them a base coat of silver on the lenses, and then gone over that with Tamiya Smoke. Now Tamiya Smoke, as most of you know, is like other Tamiya paints, doesn't like to brush at all. So what I do is I mix in a little bit of Tamiya's acrylic retarder, and that makes it flow well enough to do this kind of thing without leaving brush marks. But if that doesn't satisfy me, if I'm not completely happy with the reflectivity and level of gloss, then I will also put a layer of future on those, which I did. And I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, I think you can agree that's a pretty realistic looking set of goggles. So I'm cool with that. What I hope this kind of points out is that there's kind of 2 strategies with figures, and one is to, like I'm trying to do, sort of create realistic looking textures and levels of sheen. The other strategy is to paint everything. And in my mind, you have to do one or the other. You can't really mix and match if you want the thing to really look effective. And if you're painting all of your reflections, then pretty much the entire figure is going to have the same level of sheen. Whether that's totally flat, semi-gloss, whatever it is. Whereas on the other hand, if you're doing what I try to do, you're going to have different levels of sheen. So anyway, that's that. Okay, so there you go. A little bit of Rube Goldberg figure painting adventure. And a little bit of instructional. And I apologize because I know that I'm sure what some of you guys want to see is actual painting in action. I mean, that's what I would want to see. But that's just not going to happen on this one, obviously, because it's done. But the other thing is, as I have often complained, I just suck at doing work on camera. And the truth is that I'm just not confident enough in my figure painting abilities to feel like I could effectively do a video showing the work as it's happening. So I don't know when that's going to happen, or if maybe when I've done another 10 of these. And at the rate I'm going, since I do like one a year, it's going to be a while. I think you may be able to find some stuff on YouTube, but it is a little bit frustrating. I know when I went looking for some live action tutorials on figure painting with oils over acrylics, I really couldn't find much. So if you do, you might post some of those links in the comments below. There's no shortage of stuff about how to do it with acrylics. But again, I'm not an acrylics guy, and it's a little bit baffling to me, because to me, oils are just so much easier and more intuitive and more forgiving that you would think there would be more out there, but there's just not. So I don't know what the deal is with that, but I do hope that what I have done here is useful and helpful, because I've at least tried to explain the what and the why, even if I've fallen short on demonstrating the how. But look, if you're looking to improve your figure painting skills, I really recommend these 1/10 scale busts. Young Miniatures is not the only ones that make them. There's quite a few, and there's a vast variety of interesting and cool subjects. They're not cheap. I mean, I think this one was like 40 or 50 bucks. I got it on eBay from a hobby shop in the United States, so it wasn't too bad, I guess. But if with nothing else, you can always paint, strip, repaint, and just keep using them as practice pieces. One thing I would caution you to be aware of, though, is that there are fakes out there. Recasting is a real issue with resin figure producers. So just be careful of that. If it seems too cheap to be true, probably is, and you definitely don't want to support the bad guys. But these things are great. I just really think that when it comes to figuring out how to do the shading and the blending and where to put your highlights and your shadows and all of that it's a lot easier to sort of try and figure it out on something that is this big as opposed to something that's 1/35 or definitely 1/48. So I think these are a great way to learn figure painting if that's something that you want to do. So at any rate, I hope that what I've presented here will also help you, and as always, I definitely appreciate you watching. Much love.